What's up, everybody? Welcome to your latest episode of Nuclear Barbarians. It is I, Emmett, your nuclear barbarian, and I'm excited today because we're doing a little bit of a departure from nuclear, which I think is important every now and again. And it is not the only energy source in our world. There are many others, and many of them are important. And we are not going to be talking about nuclear in the Western context or energy in the Western context. We are going to talk about Africa, specifically Ethiopia, and specifically hydro in Ethiopia. And I have a guest to talk to us about this who I'm really excited to have. This is William from Crisis Group. What is up, man? How's it going?
I'm doing well, Emmett, and yeah, thanks very much for inviting me. And very much looking forward to having this chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into like everything we're going to get into with the situation, I want to know a little bit more about Crisis Group, and I'd love to know a little bit more about you. So what is Crisis Group? What do you guys do over there?
Cool. Yeah. So I think certainly the least interesting aspect of all this is me. So I'll be pretty brief about that.
Totally.
Crisis Group's a bit more interesting. It's an international NGO, donor-funded NGO, gets a lot of money from governments, but also from various foundations and stuff. And I should know this a bit more expertly, but I think it was basically set up in the kind of aftermath or dying days of the Balkans crisis. And I think some big players in the international system, including I think Richard Holbrooke, they were like, we need an organization that acts as something of an early warning mechanism for the international system. Like we need something which is analyzing politics and telling us when basically shit is about to hit the fan. And because I think people were kind of blindsided to some extent by the Balkans crisis, right?
Totally.
And the collapse of Yugoslavia. And so that's its function. So obviously it focuses on conflict, but also on anywhere where there's sort of deadly political violence or which could turn into conflict. And then we have people like me. So I'm the Ethiopia senior analyst. So we have dedicated country experts. Obviously, we follow the politics, and we are doing research, and then we put that research and provide analysis in the form of papers that are freely available. And then we do a bunch of like private and public advocacy work. So you give a lot of media interviews. You also speak to diplomats and stakeholders and governments and stuff to obviously seek their views, but also give your views. And I think one major component of what we do, and obviously something which upsets people, is we also offer recommendations, policy about what we think people should do as well. And with regards to me, so I was a journalist in the UK, like worked in the local, I'm a Brit and from Cambridge. I worked in local newspapers in Cambridgeshire for the first 3 years of my career. And then I moved out to Ethiopia and got the Bloomberg stringer position in 2010 in Addis Ababa. So I was their Ethiopia correspondent. I did that for 7 years. Then the politics started getting kind of crazy around 2014, 15. So I started doing other freelancing, focusing a bit more on politics, and then actually set up my own website after quitting Bloomberg in 2017. I was doing other different types of journalism. I set up my own website, Ethiopia, which is very much still running. And it was kind of subsequent to that I got the Crisis Group position because of the profile and experience and knowledge and contacts I had. So I became the Crisis Group senior analyst for Ethiopia in 2019, and here I am today. There's also stuff about deportations and things, but we don't have to get into that. I'm based in Nairobi these days, not Addis Ababa, like that.
Okay, cool. So that's exciting. All right. I'm really unfamiliar with the African context. So I'm going to need your help a little bit filling in the African context because I don't know a lot about that history and we don't need to get too deep into it. But before we talk about a major infrastructural project that impacts not just Ethiopia, but the region, I was wondering if you could kind of tell us like what's going on generally in that neighborhood.
Yeah, obviously it's a tricky one to summarize. I guess some key things to understand is that Ethiopia is a very large sub-Saharan African country. I think it's the world's largest landlocked nation, actually, by population. Wow. I believe. There's obviously some complexity to that. I used to have access to the sea, but it lost when Eritrea used to be a former Ethiopian province, became independent in 93. Ethiopia lost its access to the sea. But anyway, Ethiopia is a very large African country. It has about 110 million people, so only Nigeria is bigger. Ethiopia is the overwhelming dominant country in the Horn of Africa by geography. So Horn of Africa generally comprises Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, Sudan, South Sudan, and Ethiopia. Sometimes people will include Kenya, I suppose. And the Horn of Africa ultimately is quite a troubled region, quite a conflict-prone region, quite fragile. I guess it's notable. I mentioned Eritrea's secession. Became independent in 1993, but of course we also had the creation of South Sudan in 2011, if I recall correctly, after a very long war with Khartoum. And then we also have the sort of quasi-state of Somaliland, which has a government and a currency and an army and stuff, but just no one's recognized it as a nation state. So that's a sort of, I guess formally it's a very autonomous province of Somalia, but it has all the trappings of a nation state. So you can see that it's quite a troubled parts of the world, even in terms of like the integrity of the nation states. I'm not sure like where else to take this. I mean, Ethiopia had a period of like relatively rapid growth, a lot of infrastructural investment that we can go into. But, I think if people know about Ethiopia, they will know it for being, a country which has suffered famines and is generally, and it definitely still has, very low per capita incomes. It's also a very rich country in terms of its resources, in terms of its culture, in terms of its history as well. It has this sort of ancient Orthodox Christian civilization. It's a multi-religious nation, has a very large Muslim population. It's ethnically and culturally incredibly diverse, which also creates political problems, because I think that the management and the accommodation of that diversity is unsettled in Ethiopia, and that very much contributes to some of the political problems. Politics is, to a large degree, organized around identity in Ethiopia. And so I know I'm getting a bit fixated on Ethiopia rather than Africa, but I think it's important to understand.
No, this is great.
Okay, yeah, so it's important to understand that Ethiopians are understandably incredibly proud of this. They were not colonized, and indeed they fought off Italian attempts in 1896, famously, the Battle of Adwa. Now, there was an Italian occupation of Ethiopia by Mussolini and his fascists, so the 36 to 41. But essentially, Ethiopia was never colonized the way that other countries were. So they're very, very proud of that. Ethiopia was an imperial state itself. So there was very powerful, mainly Christian kingdoms in the north of the country. And then as sort of your power was consolidated, then there was an expansion from those northern centers of power. And they incorporated other elements of what is now Ethiopia into what became the modern nation state. So a lot of that happened during the time of the European imperial expansion, late 19th century, created modern day Ethiopia, but also led to allegations and perceptions by some of these incorporated people that they were simply the subjects of this imperial state, and that they weren't ever treated as equal Ethiopian citizens. And obviously those claims of legitimacy, I mean, they were part of an imperial state. Orthodox Christianity was a state religion. You had an emperor who ruled he ruled absolutely because of his divine right. And the reason for stating this is that sort of creation of modern day Ethiopia led to a kind of explosion of identity-based politics in the 60s and the 70s. That led to an explosion of ethno-national liberation movement, and there was a popular revolution in 1974. But without getting too stuck in the detail, the way that Ethiopians tried to manage this was that in the 1990s, they put together what is known as a multinational or ethnic federation, not that dissimilar to the Soviet Union or Yugoslavia, both obviously no longer, as a way to try and manage the country's diversity. So allowing a lot of autonomy for regions which had a strong kind of identity or ethnic character to them. But that system in itself is quite controversial, and generally, like that system of ethnic politics and ethnic state structures is highly valued by those groups and political organizations which really promote their identity and autonomy, whilst others see it as a blow to Ethiopia's national character and its national unity and the integrity of the state. So you have those kind of political divisions.
Right. So we have sort of, if I'm hearing you right, we have entrenched faction problems that are both historical and cultural, but now also formalized to a degree by the attempt to ventilate those factional problems themselves.
Yeah, that's very, very nicely put. Yeah.
Okay. No, that's interesting. So that seems like a difficult context for major infrastructural projects to arise, because even when you have states that have greater cultural or whatever unanimity, it is still hard to get everyone to the table to agree on major projects. Is that what happens with this dam?
Yeah, so I say when we say this dam, right, we need to explain.
Yeah, perhaps we
talking
should.
about.
Yeah. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Yeah, so let's talk about the dam, and then we'll get into that question, and we'll start to tie it all together. So this dam, what is it? Where is it? What's the deal?
Yeah, no. So I think we've done well here. I think I got a tiny bit like tangled in the weeds there, but you got us out of that. So I think we can now lead up quite neatly to the dam itself. So I was describing this federation where you have a bunch of like autonomous units with quite different they have these ethnic characters to them. So this was basically counteracted, as occurred in other similar systems. This was counteracted by a very strong and essentially authoritarian ruling coalition. So it was a four-party coalition made up of the ruling parties from the four most powerful regions. You had a bunch of other ruling parties from other regions, but they were less populous. Now, the point about this is that this was the sort of like the glue that held the federation together, and it did so in a pretty like classically sort of Marxist-Leninist authoritarian party style. Also bred a lot of resentment, as you can imagine. It was a very, very controlling structure. And really the dominant character in this was Prime Minister Meles, and he's a rebel leader from a province in the north called Tigray. He ran a party called the Tigray People's Liberation Front, still major feature in Ethiopian politics because it's involved in the ongoing civil war. But without going down that tangent, this party, we'll just call it the EPRDF, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, this coalition. It was very, very dominant, and there were times when there were signs of the system opening up and it kind of tolerating pluralism and dissent, and then it kind of clamped down and just continued to really completely control. But this was not a kleptocratic regime, right? It was incredibly controlling. It was a leftist regime, very strong ideas about the need for the state to play a prominent role in the economy, especially for a developing country like Ethiopia. A very strong focus on the rural masses. How are we going to improve the life of the average Ethiopian farmer who is just farming on a tiny plot of land and is basically engaged in subsistence farming? So trying to improve those basic services, health, education, all sorts of agricultural input programs. None of it like brilliantly efficient, but basically quite a lot of good intention. In terms of investing the country's kind of fairly meager resources and taking whatever foreign resources they could get to invest in basic services to help the lot of the average Ethiopian. So very authoritarian, very controlling, civil liberties nowhere to be seen, really, but quite a strong focus, somewhat China style, I guess, on these development objectives, right? So this is sort of broadly describes the system. And then what happened in 2010 is there was an even bigger crackdown on the opposition in the preceding years. And then he said, it's time to go for broke here. Like what Ethiopia needs is a gigantic public investment program in vital infrastructure, right? So we need universities, we need roads, we need sugar factories, you name it, we need it. And the other thing we need is dams. We need big dams, and they already had a dam building program. We want to scale that up because we lack energy. That is one of the areas where we're completely deficient. We're deficient in all sorts of vital infrastructure, but we also want to capitalize on one of Ethiopia's main sort of assets or comparative advantages, which is it is actually blessed with multiple river basins, and it has this very kind of dramatic topography, which creates a lot of hydropower potential. Right? So it's something like 45,000 gigawatts of hydropower potential, and this is where the sort of the big dam projects stem from that. But please do come in.
Yeah, no, I just want to point out for listeners that this is a pretty standard playbook for development. Like right or left or whatever. I mean, we can even take a look at North America, Canada and America, for saying we need to improve the lot of our subsistence farmers and we need a lot more electrification and things like that. I mean, that is straight out of the New Deal playbook. And looking around and taking a look at what your best river resources are for that is something that developed nations did on their way to becoming developed. So Ethiopia here seems to be playing by the historical rules, so to speak, in terms of how its government sees that it needs to go about this project.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And comparisons with the Hoover Dam have been made with the project that we're not quite talking about yet, which is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. But I think I just wanted to finish by saying, as much as this ruling coalition was like this kind of authoritarian force which held together quite centrifugal tendencies in the federation, when they launched this infrastructure public investment program around 2010. Mm-hmm. Also, that was kind of to get beyond ethnic politics by people who were essentially proponents of identity politics, but they were also saying, we need to do something as a nation. Like, our common enemy is poverty, regardless of our ethnicity and our culture. And the one thing we can all get behind is this: to utilize these resources, particularly our water and hydropower resources, and then particularly the Nile, because Ethiopia is the source of the majority of the Nile's waters. The Blue Nile is the major tributary, and it originates in Ethiopia. And for centuries and decades, Ethiopia believed that it had been denied the right to really benefit from this resource. So that was the kind of context to when Meles launched the dam. So I guess we need to move on to that.
And we've arrived and we've done the preface.
Yeah. So a good way to tell this is that, obviously as a Bloomberg reporter, I used to try and follow the local press. So it was a very interesting story one day, and this reporter called Tesfalam, he reported from some government source that Project X was being considered by the Ethiopian government, a major hydropower project on the Blue Nile. I thought that was pretty interesting. We had a very rare press conference coming up with Meles as the International Press Corps, and I was privileged enough to attend. Meles, a spectacular politician and statesman and historical figure. So really kind of felt, privileged to be there. He's an incredibly controversial figure as well. Lots of Ethiopian opponents, and he died very prematurely just a year later, at the age of 57.
Wow.
But I didn't know what to ask. But I was working for Bloomberg, and we're looking for big economic stories. So I said to Meles, I was pretty nervous. I said, so I've been reading the local rag, and they're talking about this Project X. Is this a real thing, Mr. Prime Minister? And he confirmed it. And that was the first public announcement of what was to become the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And this was just a very kind of relatively a very, very significant thing, because it was by far Ethiopia's biggest ever infrastructure project. It turned out to be the absolute centerpiece of this infrastructural building program, this public investment program. You forget the railways and everything else, the other dams, the sugar factories. This was it, gigantic projects. Initially, I think they said it was going to be 6,000. They said it was going to be a 6,000 megawatt dam, and creating a absolutely huge reservoir and this type of thing. But not only was it very, very significant for Ethiopia, like, it was immediately obvious that this would have kind of regional kind of geopolitical implications, because a dam of such size on the main tributary of the Nile was always going to cause a lot of consternation downstream, particularly in Egypt, which is so incredibly heavily reliant on the Nile. So that's really where the story of the GERD starts, certainly for me, with that press conference with Meles in 2011 when it was announced.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So there are a lot of interesting things happening there. I mean, yeah, if people are downstream from you and you're going to dam a river, they're going to have a lot to say about that, and these infrastructure projects, they take a long time. Often they take a lot of money. And so you need steady commitment and consensus over time so that the money keeps flowing until it's completed. That is a challenge for anybody. And I'm wondering if Ethiopia starts to run into challenges of that type as they're building it. It seems like some controversial things happen, including one of the managers getting shot in a car, if I remember rightly. So how is it received over
chief
time?
Engineer.
Yeah, the chief engineer. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I think that we're in 2022 now, right?
Yes.
And the thing's not built. So kind of like testimony to what you just said about these type of big projects and the challenge that was presented. And so we're more than a decade on. But I think in many ways it was a sort of both kind of political masterstroke. It was a real gambit by Meles, and that was for two reasons. One was because regardless of Ethiopia's political or societal divisions, they all backed this project pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
You don't meet too many Ethiopians who said, yeah, that's a bad idea. They absolutely backed it.
That's amazing. That's amazing
Because,
that an energy source could trump whatever sectarian stuff is going on in society. I think that speaks to it being a political masterstroke, as you said. Not is it just a great play politically, but it also shows how everyday people can recognize their own energy interests.
yeah, I think so. And there's all this sort of historical resonance in Ethiopia, the belief that they've been denied the rights to use the Nile by Egypt and the colonial masters, the Ottomans, the Brits, and all the rest of it. But also, just like you're saying, and it was a very, it was a government and a ruling party that was very dominant. Meles was a very dominant figure. They sold it as the centerpiece of Ethiopia's renaissance, right? So you're speaking to people's national pride. You're also saying that we all face our number one enemy is poverty, and this project is going to help us overcome it. So you've got all the ingredients there, and then you've also got a government which was pretty crude but pretty good at propaganda and mobilization as well. So and then there was another specific thing that they did, which is they literally got people's buy-in to the dam by selling bonds for it.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure that this really raised the type of capital you need for a $5 billion project of this nature, but they got a lot of Ethiopians to buy some pretty small denomination bonds, so that people were literally invested in the project. It also speaks to the project's popularity, but it was also another kind of canny move by Meles and his government to get people's support for it. So I think the point is that there was a lot of opposition in Egypt. There's a lot of people like me saying like, "Oh, this is going to be very expensive, very challenging. Sure, this is the right way to invest your scarce resources, because that's the job of like people like me." But essentially, it got off to a pretty good start on its own terms.
But then I'm guessing some speed bumps start to happen along the way.
I mean, and I think it is a long story, and I think a lot of the initial drama and throughout has been related to the regional aspects of this.
So Egypt is not happy.
No, Egypt's not happy. And what Ethiopia did is they sort of agreed to convene an international panel of experts on the dam. I think it's sort of 3 experts from each country, Sudan, Egypt, Ethiopia, and then 3 neutrals. Obviously a bunch of engineers and experts and hydrologists and stuff. And they studied the project because Ethiopia, this was a bit of a fait accompli, right? They just sprang this upon people. And I guess one thing.
Yeah, it was called Project X after all.
It was called Project X, yeah. And so they did start it without telling anyone. But I think that one of the things that I haven't explained is because this was a symbol of Ethiopia's renaissance and Ethiopia's, the end of Ethiopia's dependency, they were trying to portray it as such. And therefore they said it was self-financed. So they never sought kind of World Bank or European Investment Bank or African Development Bank funding, right? And that meant there was sort of less due diligence commitment. So they hadn't really done all of like the environmental social impact studies and this type of thing that you would have to do if you go for multilateral finance. The problem with this was that it created even greater suspicion and sort of justification for opposition by these downstream nations. They're saying, we have no idea about this project. Is it going to be safe? What's going to be the impact, whether in terms of ecosystems or water supplies, and you name it. Other people had concerns about displacement, including the usual suspects from the NGO sector. And so one of the things that Ethiopia did in response, they agreed to convene this international panel of experts. And actually, in another like notable part of my pretty like unnotable journalistic career was that when this expert panel finalized its report, they could, as often, they couldn't agree on publishing it because they couldn't, they didn't want to publish it. They couldn't reach consensus. But someone leaked it to me. I imagine someone from Cairo, and we did the report on it for Bloomberg, and the Ethiopian government got pretty upset. But essentially, the panel of experts said, we don't really have enough information about this dam yet. The Ethiopian government really hasn't done its due diligence in terms of working out what is going to be the impact on the hydrological system, what is going to be the social environmental, the broader social environmental impact assessment of this dam. More studies need to be done. So then everyone tried to spin it from their perspective. Ethiopians said that they've assessed that there's no problem with the dam. The Egyptians said that the Ethiopians basically don't know what they're doing. And things went on from there. And there was a sort of subsequent agreement between the 3 parties to set up a kind of trilateral negotiation process. So, things got off to a good start, like I say, from Ethiopia in terms of the public support, in terms of really putting the downstream countries on the back foot. But then they also, I think, suffered from this quite sort of secretive, quite unilateral, quite ultimately rushed approach, because this was not just an engineering project. This was also a big political statement as well. And I think they also kind of got themselves into a bit of trouble because of that approach.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, this is also just so, and we don't have to get into this here, but it's worth mentioning that this is so fascinating because it's also what happens to sovereignty when you have so many neighbors. There are natural resources that stretch across borders. And then you also have an international NGO complex, and they have their own thing to say. I mean, as you would know, Crisis Group is one of those groups that has things to say about certain issues. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's inconvenient, sometimes maybe it's even bad, but it shows how difficult it is to negotiate a project like this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, it was an assertion of sovereignty and power by Ethiopia's government. But obviously, it's not all one-way traffic. They're facing powerful opponents. And I think, with international water law and transboundary water courses, you've got these kind of like the relevant kind of principles are you can do it, you can use your own resource, transboundary resource, don't cause significant harm to your downstream neighbors, right? And then it's like, yeah, you can use your water for your own development and to create jobs and all the rest of it, but it has to be kind of reasonable and equitable utilization of a shared resource.
Yes.
But the thing is, this is international law, right? This is just a bunch of principles that people get to argue about, and then power. But then it's all about power politics in the end, right?
Right. They're more like guidelines than laws.
Yeah, and who enforces international law? What does the rule of law have to do with the UN Security Council's makeup and decision-making dynamic? So it is a bit of the law of the jungle, and so really, this was Ethiopia asserting itself and saying, "What are you going to do about it?" Like, this is our justifications for it. We get to utilize our own water resources. This is the way we overcome poverty
with our own money too. With our own money. That's I think hugely important and cannot be undersold.
And we're doing this for our own benefits, but we're not going to harm you. We're going to abide by those international principles. And also, it's a hydropower project, right? It's like, when it's up and running, it's a non-consumptive use of water. Like, the more electricity that Ethiopia generates, the more water that flows downstream. So these were the arguments and the justifications that were drummed into me and millions of others by the Ethiopian government as justification. And then I think the other element that you're potentially interested in here is the response of some international NGOs to the project, and also the Ethiopian government and people's response to that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, essentially, what happens, as you will well know, is that large dams have become very unfair, and people their immediate point of reference is not look at what role that played in the US's economic and industrial development. Instead, it's like, look at that environmental cataclysm in China or wherever it may be. And obviously, large dams are very destructive in terms of ecosystems. So what you tend to get is that the projects aren't necessarily treated on their merits, and there's a kind of default opposition to large dams from organizations like International Rivers, also sort of indigenous people-focused organizations like Survival International, because obviously there'll be displacement of those communities will be involved. And then when it comes to a situation like Ethiopia, when you essentially have this quite authoritarian government, which doesn't really have any time for the trappings of liberal democracy, and it goes about a project in such a cavalier, secretive, unilateral fashion, well, that doesn't just arouse suspicion and opposition in Cairo. That also makes other people very concerned about it. And this was also the case with other big dams in Ethiopia, especially a notable one in the south of the country, which did have a big effect in terms of displacing people. So as well as this regional opposition because of these water supply concerns, the Ethiopian government and Meles himself got into these sort of raging ideological power struggles with other foreign adversaries. And really the argument, as I've kind of already stated from the Ethiopians was, how dare you,
Right.
we don't have much, and we've seen how you developed, we see how you used your resources, we saw the negative side effects of that. In fact, we're still suffering from it, and we're going to suffer from it because of the carbon emissions and all the rest of it. How dare you say that we are not allowed to, especially to create our own renewable energy resource?
Yeah, you're pulling up the ladder, basically.
You're pulling up the ladder, and also it just doesn't make sense in terms of those broader kind of climate change debates as well. So the problem was that there was this lack of due diligence from Ethiopia, and still to this day we don't really know that much about the impact of this project. But then some of the attacks on the project, on the government from these various quarters, you can also see that there is. You could make a case that the Ethiopian cause is a just one, that they had not benefited from this resource. It was non-consumptive, and they were doing it for the right reasons, which was to try and overcome poverty. And I think generally, certainly the Ethiopian government has never been swayed from its path from this project. And even we could talk about some of the political turbulence, but even with a different administration and leadership coming to power, there was never any doubt that they would essentially support this project because of that, it's popular acceptance in Ethiopia.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So I guess my next question is where in 2022, it's been 10 years. Like, how near or far is the end of this dam, and how do the Ethiopian people seem to feel? I'm sure there's more than one feeling from more than one group of people within Ethiopia about the progress of the dam.
Yeah, so I think the sad thing almost is that this sort of diplomatic game of trying to sort of head off Egyptian attempts to get the UN Security Council to look at the project, and generally kind of assert Ethiopia's sovereignty. The US, the Trump administration, got very involved in negotiations. And it's like these mini battles are won, and they kind of become, they sort of become the focus of Ethiopian energy. But then you've got the actual project, which is delayed, and there's still a long way to go for Ethiopians really to benefit from it. So let me try and unpack some of that. I think the diplomatic focus for years now has been to get a deal, right? A deal on the filling and operating rules for the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And so that kind of Ethiopia, and they all agree on how much water Ethiopia is going to put in the reservoir during the impoundment period. They agree on dispute resolution processes, the legal side of things, but they also agree on how the GERD will be used in the event of drought, how it will be used to mitigate drought. So all of these sort of different aspects. And so this has been the focus of negotiations with a bunch of African and international involvement for years now. And then as they failed to reach agreement, it's sort of raised the diplomatic tensions essentially. And this really has become the focus of things. And I think, many Ethiopians, there's no questions to be asked them. Many of them still consider Egypt's stance, for example, to be very unjust and to be very supportive of Ethiopia's right to build the thing. Then you've got the actual construction of this gigantic engineering project. And as you sort of noted, I first reported that they would generate initial power from 2 turbines in 2015. That didn't happen. It happened 2 months ago, where they started early generation from 2 lower set turbines. We've got 13 turbines. No one's really clear on the state of construction with them. And as you can imagine, these electromechanical components are by far the most expensive, most technically demanding, most time-consuming elements of the project. There's obviously massive civil works to be done, but it's far less sophisticated stuff. So, the structure is to a large degree in place. The filling process has been going on for a couple of years, but we only have 2 out of 13 turbines installed. The idea of the GERD, also the Renaissance Dam, the GERD we call it, was that it would make Ethiopia into a sort of regional electricity hub, right? So it's supposed to produce 15,000 gigawatt hours of power. And that's double what Ethiopia produces now, right? So you can see the impact that they're going to have on the economy. But also that's
I could see how if those are the numbers, everybody was just like, yeah, okay, do whatever you need to do.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a ton. But then you'd need a lot of like industrial investment. You'd also need to reconnect a lot of, you need to connect a lot
you need transmission, you need balancing, you need all of the things that a grid's going to have, because I think the thing people forget sometimes is that grids are going to have generation, transmission, and distribution. And those things need to be balanced. So
Yeah.
you can't just build a huge generation project and then be like, all right, done. Like we can all go home. We have our 13 turbines running. Like that's going to have to go somewhere. People are going to have to monitor that 24/7. Like that's a whole project unto itself.
Yeah, and then yeah, no, absolutely. And then so realistically in Ethiopia, you're also talking about just like an urbanization project almost, right? Because you've got something like 80% of the country population still living in some sort of fairly like dispersed rural settlements, right? So if you're going to connect them all up to the grid, it's going to be much easier if they're living in much more kind of agglomerated settlements. So that's all part of the project here. But also what I was getting to is that the idea is that this would produce a surplus for sale, for export, and therefore Ethiopia could generate some foreign currency. It doesn't have that many valuable exports, just like commodity and coffee, sesame, and also Ethiopian Airlines is a big foreign currency earner. And so they were hoping to turn it into a sort of cash cow as well. But then again, like as in line with what you were saying, then you need to build the transmission lines. Some of that's been done. The World Bank's done some, the African Development Bank. But then you also need to strike the power deals with your neighbors. Well, they haven't been doing that. They've just been arguing with their neighbors about their right to build the project. So it's all these like incredibly important nuts and bolts to make this investment in the project that Ethiopians were so happy to do. But to actually get returns from that, all of these different pieces have to fall into place. First, you need to just install the turbine to start generating some power. Then you need to have somewhere to send the power. Like, is it going to all these like villages, like homesteads? Presumably not. Like there was some manufacturing investment, but then that's died off partly because of the political problems. And we don't have the export deals in place because that kind of regional side of things has really been a massive problem.
Yeah. So I don't want to do, I am going to do, but maybe not in the typical American way, the thing where I use American history to talk about this. And I only want to do this because in the West, we are already developed. America is, insanely wealthy and powerful. And so I think it is easy for us to forget the fights and conflicts that went into that even happening. And one of those are things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a big fight between the federal government, state governments, and private enterprise that had similar elements to what's going on with the fight over GERD in Ethiopia. And I want to point that out because one of the big questions was, what are we going to use all of this hydropower for even? What's going to happen? And eventually you start seeing during the 40s TVA propaganda flyers where water flows into the dam and then like Spitfire jets come out the other side. And it was the whole idea that electrification was going to make our way into World War II. So an answer soon developed for those questions, but that didn't mean that those were answers that were easy to produce or that were just decided by the people who were managing it. There is always contingency. There are always difficulties any state acting in history has to engage with. And I bring all of this up because I don't like the perspective that like, oh, that's just complicated. Like, that's just like an Africa problem. Things are so complicated there. No, it's always complicated for everybody. Now that we don't want to take out all of the specific context of what African nations have to deal with, but I think I would like to put some respect on that type of ambition and some nuance to the types of problems that Ethiopia seems to be encountering as it's trying to do this very large, very difficult project.
Yeah, no, I sympathize a lot with that. And I think this brings in the kind of like, the sort of China versus the West debate in Africa a bit as well. But essentially it's like, in these types of environments, right? So to have some sort of misallocated resources, some wastage, heaven forbid, for there to be some corruption and kickbacks involved in in contracting and some some inefficiencies and some.
Yeah, that never happens here, by the way.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and certainly didn't happen back in the late 19th century. No, but it's, I think it's a serious point, and it's about kind of learning from mistakes and being allowed to make mistakes, and I think it's about ambition is absolutely necessary, and if you aren't failing, then you're not kind of trying hard enough, and this type of thing. And I think these points are absolutely right, and I think that the point about China is that obviously they've had lots of these types of experiences as well. But if you have a gigantic infrastructural deficit, right? Like if you don't have transport, communications, and power infrastructure, how are you supposed to grow a market economy on the back of that, right? Yeah. So there is, as I understand it, really no alternative to these types of investments. Is the private sector going to come in and do it? No, of course it's not. Like there's going to have to be considerable public investment involved. So I think that you're absolutely along the right lines there, and I think that's how I've always seen the project. It doesn't mean, of course, that there isn't a role for annoying journalists like me or whoever. And just people saying like, hang on, what are you going to do with this power? Or are you sure you're actually going to build it to that time frame?
Is it possible for this to be the base load you think it is?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, quite. Yeah, stuff. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, fair questions to ask.
Is this what we need right now? Because we've skipped over so much detail because this became a political project. Melez just decided to build the biggest fucking dam that he could, right? Like, for decades, like engineers had been surveying the Blue Nile, and they're like, oh, we could build one here, and then we could build there, like a nice cascade of dams, very neat. When it came to it, they just built the biggest thing they could to make a statement. And to get Ethiopians to rally. But of course, that means you're losing something in terms of efficiency, so people can criticize it on these grounds. The way, again, this lack of due diligence, the relative secrecy, the unilateralism, it does raise concerns about safety as well. I mean, we have a very reputable very big reputable international company, Salini, as the main kind of contractor here. So you imagine they know what they're doing. But also, like I say, because of some of the ways that Ethiopia went about the project, it does raise questions. So it's this question about just like understanding the difference between the principle and the necessity of that type of approach to really combat poverty, to really try and kickstart industrial development. Because what other option do they have? It's accepting that and parking that and remembering that. But then also you've also got a very long and convoluted and complicated, political and economic process on the back of that, where at all sorts of steps along the way, there's lots of reasons to go like, hang on, what's going on here? And note, you mentioned the assassination of the project at one point. Well, sorry, suicide. So there's all sorts of, all sorts of things have gone on.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to say this, I'll provide links in the show notes to some of the work Crisis Group has done, some of the things you've written about this, so people can go more deeply into it. And I don't have an answer for this, but this is a trade-off I noticed, or maybe a difficulty in some of the things that you were talking about. And on the one hand, I think it is fair for Egypt and others to say, hey, this was very unilateral and secret. What the hell is going on? On the other hand, I totally understand doing it that way to circumvent what could be a political theater of an investigation process into what the best way to do it is, that is only interested in postponing Ethiopia's ambitions, because I could see that falling out of the geopolitics of this as well. I think that's a hard thing for anyone to navigate. I certainly, as ignorant as I am on this, have no deeper insights than that, only that when we're thinking about development in context, I would like to more embody in my own thinking that level of humility of, yeah, this seems to be tense and I don't have all the answers.
Yeah, no, I think so. There's all sorts of reasons not to do it,
Sure.
We can come up, there's all sorts of risks associated with
the
it.
safest dam that exists is the dam that doesn't exist.
Yeah, no, quite. And I think you could say all sorts of things. You could make my point about urbanization. You could say, well, why don't you do that first, and then we'll deliver power to people when they're all in towns. You could say, fix your electricity tariff first, or get some basic kind of export plan in place. But then you just potentially get tied up in all these processes and planning. And so I do sympathize, like if you're going to get something like this done, which is potentially transformative, then it does speak to the logic of using that type of more unilateral approach, where you just say, this is our objective. We're a sovereign government. We have the support of the Ethiopian people. We're doing it. Deal with it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. We're a
that's
sovereign country. Like, that's the way it is.
Yeah, and of course, of course, there's legitimate and very, very serious downstream concerns, and I have to be very careful, and I do genuinely understand those, and also there's aspects of Ethiopian unilateralism that have just simply seemed completely unnecessary at times. But that essential, that fundamental initial decision to say what I just said, this is absolutely vital for us as a nation. We're going to do it. Deal with it. I think we can all understand the logic of that when we think about the context of Ethiopia's predicament, or the predicament of any country like Ethiopia.
Yeah. No, that's great. So I think we'll end it there. William, where can people find you? Where can they find Crisis Group's work? How do they learn more about this?
So you don't want to hear about the assassination, then we'll leave that for the part two.
Yeah, we'll leave that for part two. So I mean, there's just so much.
The suicide.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much. Like, you and I could talk about this issue for another 4 hours, I feel like.
Yeah. No, you're right. There's lots of components to it. I don't know how Simonu died, but he was a very revered figure in Ethiopia. He was very popular. It was a truly shocking event, and I don't actually know what happened, but it is part of a much bigger story about how Ethiopia's kind of power politics and identity politics, how it played into the dam itself. But once the politics, at least once a new administration took power, they also got behind the project, even though it became quite heavily politicized for a while. So I just wanted to get that in there at least. But so obviously, like any one in my type of profession these days, I have a Twitter handle. Troll me there. Lots of people do, Emmett. So that's W Davison 10. And so you can find all Crisis Group's work is public on the website. So just search Crisis Group Ethiopia, and then you could also find the Ethiopia Insight, the website I set up in 2018, pretty easily as well with a Google search.
Perfect. And those of you who don't want to Google search, go to the show notes. I always put this stuff in there. Go to that. If you're wondering, hey, where is that? It's in the show notes.
We can put a couple of links there, because there's quite a lot of gaps to fill in, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those who are interested.
Right. And I encourage anybody who's interested to really dive into this. I think there's so much to learn. It's a fascinating issue. Listeners like me, and I'm sure this is pretty much 100% of my listeners, except for the handful of people that listen to whatever I have to say. If you're very interested in how to alleviate poverty through energy projects in the developing world, I think there's a lot to take a look at and learn from this Ethiopian example. So, William, thanks so much for coming on. Everybody, stay sharp, stay strong, stay radiant, and we will see you next time.